are two regions of the heart. I would more likely ask that on the dissection, but I'm gonna show where it is on the model. So the apex is the pointy part, and then the base is the broad part that these vessels are coming out of, like the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So apex is at the bottom, base is at the top, and I would more likely do that on the dissection, because it's easy to just put a pin. And it's like, what region of the heart is it? So the apex is at the pointy part. Then we have the anterior interventricular sulcus. That would also more likely be on the dissection, because on the models, it's a sulcus is like a valley. Just like when we did the brain in AMP1, the sulcus is a valley. So that's in between the ventricles, interventricular. There's a valley that these blood vessels are in. So the blood vessels are sitting on the anterior interventricular sulcus. So it'd be a lot easier to ask that on the actual dissection where you don't have blood vessels on it. So, but it's just a valley in between the ventricles, and the ventricles are on the bottom of the heart. Then pericardium says thin layer, I'm reading Hershey, has thin layer within heart. Pericardium is going around the heart. And so we will talk in lecture about the layers of the pericardium, how it's like 3 layers. And the outer layer of the heart wall is called the visceral pericardium, or it's called the epicardium. So the outer layer of the heart wall has 2 different names. They're synonyms. So the pericardium is a sac that goes around the heart. It's a serous membrane. It has fluid outside of it so we can deal with friction. So typically pericardium doesn't get asked, but I like to cover it in lab because it helps reinforce the lecture. The heart wall is 3 layers thick. The outermost layer is epicardium, but it's also called the visceral pericardium. And there's 2 other layers of pericardium that are not, you can't have on a model. So 3 layers of the heart wall: epi, myo, endo. So if you have it open, it's like obvious that epi is just the outside of the heart. And so the very outside of the heart, I guess it's closed, whatever, the outside. And if I want layer of the heart wall, I would ask, identify the indicated layer of the wall. I'd always straight up say that. You wouldn't be wondering, like, what the hell is he asking? Is this heart? Is that the answer? And so epi means upon, and that's the outside. Most of the heart wall is myocardium. Most of the heart wall is muscle. And if I was going to ask it on a model, I'd likely would stick it on this anterior, on this interventricular septum, not anterior, interventricular septum, which is the wall between the ventricles. And so you can see it's mainly muscle. And then endocardium is just it's a little bit of, it's simple squamous epithelium and a little bit of areolar connective tissue. So it's just the inside layer. So I basically would stick it in one of the cavities of the heart, one of the chambers, and ask what layer of the heart wall is this. So the outer layer and inner layer are really thin, and they are simple squamous with a little bit of areolar connective tissue. And then most of the heart wall is myocardium. The myocardium, it's often when it's on the dissection because it's really easy to just stick a pin. Interatrial septum, I cover for completeness. Typically, as in never, do I ask it, but it's just the wall in between the atria. So atria are the 2 chambers at the top, ventricles are the chambers at the bottom, but I still like to cover it for completeness because I really care about the interventricular septum. And that's because it has to do with something important about the electrical signal of the heart. I'll be talking about the interventricular septum. But interatrial, it's just the wall, like my nasal septum, the wall between the atria, the 2 top chambers. Never gets asked. Interventricular septum is important because, one, it's the wall in between the ventricles, but I shoot electricity down the interventricular septum, down to the apex, and then the electricity comes up the sides, and then the heart will contract from the bottom up, because first you have electricity, then you have contraction. So I do care about that because when we talk about the electrical activity, electrical pattern in a heart, I talk about we shoot it down the interventricular septum. We shoot it down this AV bundle, and I'll show that something on here. So 4 chambers of the heart. I have this A, B, C, D on here. So often, thank you, Bailey, for playing with the stickers. So there's always a station with the heart sitting like on a little stand with A, B, C, D in some various order. And I would would likely be like which chamber of the heart ships blood to the rest of the body, which chamber of the heart receives blood from the body, where does D ship its blood to, where does B get its blood from, and so we'll talk about those in lecture, but I utilize that stuff in lab. Ventricles are on the bottom, atria are on the top, and it's patient's left, patient's right. So it's right, left, patient's left, patient's right. And that's our next stuff we talk about in lecture is the heart. And remember, we're going to talk about stuff called the systemic circuit, which ships blood to our body systems, pulmonary circuit, which ships it to our lungs. And so to me, it makes sense, like the ventricles are the pumps. They're pumping blood out of the heart. The left ventricle has a really thick wall compared to the right ventricle. So the left ventricle is shipping it to the systems. The right ventricle is shipping it to the lungs. And where the hell are my lungs? They're like surrounding the heart. So I don't need a big wall. I don't need to generate as much force to ship blood to my lungs. So if I start on one side, a system, I end on the other. So if I start out on the left ventricle for systems, then I come back in the right atrium. If I start on the right ventricle, I come into the left atrium. And that's like one of the early things we say in the heart notes with the systemic and pulmonary circuit. You start on one side, you end on the other. Okay, then we get to 4 valves. AV valves, atrioventricular valves. You won't answer AV valve as an answer. You'll be saying the specific names. And they're between the top chambers, atria, and the bottom chambers, the ventricles. And so that's why AV. And you're always, if you ever do have to say AV, you're allowed to, atrioventricular, you can abbreviate it as AV. So the one on the left, and so I like to have it like, you can't see it on this model here. You can see it on every other model. But usually I like to have it like on a station like this, and I'm like, what valve is between B and D? Or what valve is between A and C? That's how I do the AV valves. So it's just knowing the left is bicuspid, the right is tricuspid. And I remember, what's the abbreviation for pound?
OBS.
LB. I didn't say pounds. LB. So left bicuspid, and then right tricuspid. The bicuspid is also called the mitral valve, and you'll probably see that more used in a hospital, but I like sticking with bicuspid because LB. And it's just a lot easier. Remember, the one on the left is the bicuspid because the abbreviation of pound is LB. But you'll probably see it called mitral valve in a hospital setting. The semilunar valves, so those are between a blood vessel through which blood has left the heart and one of the ventricles. So the pulmonary valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve is right here at the bottom of this thing called the pulmonary trunk. And it's an artery, but it's blue because the blood is deoxygenated. And so it's this little white structure at the very bottom. And that keeps blood from going back into the ventricle after I ship it towards the lungs. And then the other one is hidden, but it's in the left ventricle, and it's between the left ventricle and the aorta. And it's probably seen best on, you can see that part. So you can see this right here would be pulmonary valve, and then right here, the aortic valve, aortic semilunar valve. So they're between the ventricle and a blood vessel that we ship blood out of. Because it's all about preventing backflow with valves, making sure that once blood goes one direction, like the boy band, it keeps going that way. So chordae tendineae, they look like spider webs, and they're associated with the AV valves. So they look like spider webs, and they are attached to the AV valves. And so I will pull on them to make sure that the valve stays shut when I squeeze my ventricles. So when I squeeze the ventricles to shoot blood out of my heart, the chordae tendineae are being pulled by muscle called papillary muscle to make sure that the AV valve stays shut, so blood doesn't go back up into the atria. And so they look like spider webs. They look really cool on the sheep part. And then the papillary muscle is just at the very bottom, the red part on these models, but that the AV valves are attached to. So the actual little muscle ridges that the chordae tendineae are attached to is called papillary muscle. It'll look like a little finger or something on the sheep heart. And I generally like papillary muscle if I ask it more on the dissection. It's like right at the bottom of where a little spider webby thing is attaching. Okay. Trabeculae carneae. So those are the muscular ridges in the ventricles. Muscular ridges is what they are. She has open space written because she's in the picture. That's why I'd be wondering, like, what the hell are they pointing to? But what they're pointing to is the ridges, because it's hard to figure out unless someone tells you what they are, that it is the ridges in the ventricles. While we have these other ridges in the atria that are called pectinate muscles. So if I'm pointing, like on this model, to ridges on the top, pectinate muscles. If I'm pointing to ridges on the bottom, trabeculae carneae. So pectinate, trabeculae carneae. These are like one of those. Blood vessels. So feeding the right atrium, we have superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus. So superior vena cava, bringing blood back from the top part of the body. Inferior vena cava, blue, bringing blood back from the bottom of the body. And then there's this big vein right here on the back of the heart. That right there is a coronary sinus. It's bringing blood back from the outer layer of the heart back into the heart, because the heart still needs nutrients and still creates waste. And so that right there is the coronary sinus. And it stays coronary sinus all the way up here till you get to this branch going down. With blood vessels, it'll be the same road, and then there'll be a branch come off, and that same road keeps continuing, and then it changes its name. So it becomes, do I have great cardiac vein listed on here? Like, it becomes the great cardiac vein after, so that right there is not great cardiac vein. Coronary sinus becomes the great cardiac vein after this branch. So to repeat, coronary sinus and great cardiac vein are the same road. But after there's a little branch going off, going down, the coronary sinus becomes the great cardiac vein. So that's a feeding the right atrium, exiting the right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. So pulmonary trunk, it's an artery, it's a large artery, and it branches to go one to each lung. I would more likely do pulmonary trunk than I would try to do pulmonary arteries, because it's like harder to put a sticker on. But so the pulmonary trunk branches to a pulmonary artery going towards each lung. Arteries are away from the heart, veins are to the heart. It's not about oxygen and deoxygenated, it's about which one goes away from the heart, which one goes towards the heart. Pulmonary veins are going to the left atrium. So when you look inside all these hearts, you'll see 4 red circles on the inside, but you're always going to see, like on each side, 1, 2, 1, 2. So there's 4 pulmonary veins, 2 from each lung. 1, 2, 1, 2. And even though they're veins, they're red because they're full of oxygen. That's why you can't just think like, oh, that's red, it's an artery, that's blue, that's a vein. These are veins, but they're full of oxygen. Let's see, then we have the exiting the left ventricle, we have the aorta. So we'll call it like the aortic arch. You can just say aorta, aortic arch, and then it actually comes and it goes down, and when it's in your chest, it's the thoracic aorta. Then when it goes by your diaphragm and it's in your abdominopelvic, it's the abdominal aorta. And it stays aorta till it branches and arteries start to go into your legs, or getting ready to go. First they're going to not immediately into your legs, but it branches into things called the iliacs, the common iliac arteries. But its aorta is like really long. And like I said, it's in your chest, thoracic, it's in your belly area, your abdominal area, abdominal aorta. But there. And then there are 3 arteries coming off of it. And so BCS, brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. And I remember BCS for Bowl Championship Series. That's how I got it in my head from what they used to call the football stuff. Bowl Championship Series. Brachiocephalic, which then branches to be the right subclavian and the right right subclavian and the right common carotid. And then, so we don't have a left brachiocephalic artery, because the brachiocephalic, brachio means arm, cephalic means head, so it branches for the common carotid and the subclavian. But then the left ones are coming off the aorta, left common carotid, left subclavian. So you have to say left, these are left. BCS. And then we say feeding and draining the heart walls, right and left coronary arteries. So at the bottom of the aorta, you see little red arteries that are coming off the very bottom of the aorta. And so there are other names, like besides right, so I just keep it the big ones. Right coronary artery, left coronary artery. But then there's names of them. I just don't care about the branches. There's one like right here where I'm pointing. I don't ask this, but that's called the left anterior descending artery. It's also known as the widowmaker because that's what's blocked up when most people have heart attacks. So it's a branch of the left coronary artery. But there's like the circumflex, I think is a branch of the left one. There's like some people in other classes might go into a couple more names of the branches of your coronary arteries. I think it's enough just to know right coronary artery is on the right, left coronary artery is on the left. Like I said, then there's like branches of them. I'm just making you know the two big branches. But I do find it interesting that that's the widowmaker. Like after this number 50, there's like, you know, that branch and then coming straight down. That's what gets blocked on most people to cause a heart attack. That damn pizza I ate today. That's what's gonna kill me. And then I already said the great cardiac vein is the coronary sinus. Once you have this branch, the coronary sinus becomes the great cardiac vein. Probably like number 28 on this model. Conducting system is talking about the electrical pattern that goes through the heart. And you can only see it on this model. This is the only one that has the electrical, any of the electrical stuff. So we start in the right atrium, we generate electricity. And then that electricity spreads across the top of the heart and starts to come down like a wave until it gets to what we call the cardiac skeleton that separates the atria from the ventricles. Like electricity starts to come down and then it like hits a roadblock and it's like, I can't go into the ventricles. So we have to shoot it through a very specific place and shoot it down the interventricular septum to the apex. So where it starts in the right atrium, there's a little circle up here with like a number 32 on it. This is the only one that really shows this stuff good. Tiny little circle, you know, that's colored in white. That's your SA node. That's your pacemaker of the heart. That's where we generate the electricity. And then it spreads across the top of the heart. And then it starts going down like a wave. And then there's connective tissue that separates, electrically insulates the atria from the ventricles. So then there's like a number 43 here. That's the AV node. It's like, how the hell does electricity get from the atria into the ventricles? Well, it goes to these nerve cells at a place called the AV node. And that AV node is like gonna be right at the top of the interventricular septum. And then we shoot it down to the apex. So it's painted gray, and it's only on this model that it's painted gray, and that's the AV bundle that's shooting electricity down to the apex. And then it comes up the side, so this is on the walls on the side, through the Purkinje fibers. So that makes it so I contract the top of the heart down, and then stops because we're electrically insulated. So then I shoot the electricity down and it spreads up, so I contract in that same pattern from the bottom up because I need to squeeze blood up to get it out these blood vessels. And
oh God.
scene.